Here is something almost no one mentions about the 1870s. Most Americans went to bed within 90 minutes of sundown, not from exhaustion alone, but because light itself had a price that ordinary families counted carefully. A pound of tallow candles cost 15 cents in 1875, and a pound burned through in a week of evening hours. A quart of kerosene for the parlour lamp ran 12 cents in a good season, and twice that in January, when the roads were bad and the supply wagons had not come through. For a farm family measuring its margins in bushels of corn and dozens of eggs, every hour of lamplight after dark was a small arithmetic problem. And so, when the sun went down, and the dishes were washed, and the animals were settled for the night, most people simply folded themselves into the dark and went to sleep. The electric world had not yet arrived. It would not arrive in most of rural America for decades still to come. You are standing in a farmhouse kitchen in central Ohio. The year is 1875. It is 4 o'clock in the morning, and you have not been woken by an alarm. There are no alarms in this house, in this county, or in this state, but by the quiet insistence of your own body, which has learned over years of the same life that darkness before dawn is a signal and not an invitation to keep sleeping. The kitchen around you is cold, not the sharp, aggressive cold of outdoors, but the deep, patient cold of a room that has not had fire in it for 5 hours. A cold that has settled into the plaster walls and the wooden floor and the iron of the crane above the hearth as if it intends to stay. Your breath makes a thin fog in front of your face. There is no switch on the wall. There is no switch anywhere in this house. The nearest city in Ohio with electric streetlights is Cleveland, and Cleveland is 2 long days' journey by road, and you have not been there and may never go. Light in this house is fire. Warmth in this house is fire. Everything useful in the morning begins with fire, and fire begins with you. You push back the heavy quilt your mother pieced together from the usable parts of worn-out dresses and work shirts. Your feet find the cold wooden floor. The day has begun. In 1875, the United States of America is a nation of 37 states, and somewhere near 45 million people, and the vast majority of them live lives organized entirely around sunlight. The country has survived the Civil War by a decade, and is threading itself together with railroad tracks and telegraph wire, and it will not see the first practical electric light bulb for another 4 years. Thomas Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, will not produce a working incandescent lamp until October of 1879, and even then it will be years before electric light reaches beyond a handful of prosperous cities, and decades before it touches the countryside where most Americans actually live. The 1870 census recorded that roughly half of all employed Americans work in agriculture. By 1875, that figure has not changed much. Rural America is where most of the country's life is lived, and rural America will not see electricity in its homes until the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 finally carries current to farms that had been waiting 2 generations. The America you are living in 1875 is recognizable in some respects and alien in others. There are newspapers, railroads, banks, churches, general stores, one-room schoolhouses. There is the telegraph, which can carry a message from New York to San Francisco in minutes, which seems miraculous to people who have watched the same miles take a wagon 3 months to cross. There are photographs, formal, stiff cabinet cards of people who look as though they could barely breathe, standing very still in their best clothes against painted backdrops. There are books, almanacs, periodicals, mail-order catalogues beginning to appear. But in your kitchen, in your barn, in your bedroom at the end of the day, none of these things matters much. What matters is the firewood stacked in the woodshed and whether it will hold until March. What matters is the salt pork in the barrel in the root cellar and how far it will stretch. What matters is the condition of the lamp wick and the level of kerosene in the jug by the door. The house you live in was built by hand, largely by your family, over a period of years. The framing timbers were hewn from trees that grew on this land, felled in winter when the sap was down, and the ground was firm enough to drag them on sleds. The floorboards were milled at the local sawmill 7 miles east, carried home in the wagon, and nailed down by your grandfather. The plaster on the walls is lime and sand and horsehair, applied in 3 coats over split lath, dried slowly through a wet November when the house first went up. The house is tight enough to be warm in winter if you keep the fire burning. When the fire goes out, the inside temperature drops steadily toward the outside temperature by morning, and you wake to frost on the inner surface of the window glass, ice crystals growing in the corners of the panes. Your household in this house might be yourself, your spouse, 4 or 5 children, ranging from an infant to a teenager, and possibly an elderly parent, or a hired man who boards through the winter months in exchange for labor come spring. Families in 1875 are large by any later standard, and the house accommodates everyone with an efficiency that would seem impossible now. The kitchen is the living room, the dining room, the sewing room, the schoolroom in bad weather, the washroom, the space where most of life happens. The parlour, if you have one, is largely ceremonial, opened for company, for the minister when he calls, for wakes. The bedrooms are cold and private and used only for sleeping. Everything else happens in the kitchen, arranged around the fire in a way that has not changed in the fundamental since your grandparents built their first house on this land. The relationship that pre-electric Americans have with darkness is one of the most difficult things for a person raised in the electrified world to fully grasp. Darkness in 1875 is not an aesthetic quality or an inconvenience. It is a physical condition that governs everything after sundown. The kerosene lamp, which by the 1870s has largely replaced the older lard oil lamp and the tallow candle as the primary domestic light source, gives off roughly the equivalent of 2 or 3 modern candles. Gathered close in a small room, this is enough light to read by, to sew by, to see faces across the table. But it is dim light. It flickers when the air moves. It smells of kerosene, a thin, slightly sweet petroleum smell that catches in the back of the throat after a while. And beyond the lamp's circle, the room falls into genuine shadow. The corners of the kitchen are dark after sunset. The hallway is dark. The stairs are dark. You know this house by feel and memory, in the dark in ways that would astonish a person who has always moved through rooms flooded with electric light. People adapt. Human beings have adapted to darkness for the entirety of human history, and the Americans of 1875 have inherited generations of that adaptation. They go to bed earlier than modern people, often by 8 or 9 o'clock in the winter, when darkness falls before 5. They rise earlier. 4 or 5 in the morning is entirely ordinary, earlier on certain days. They schedule tasks that require precision and close vision, reading, writing, fine needlework, bookkeeping, for daylight hours whenever possible. They plan travel around the phases of the moon, because a night of full moon offers meaningfully more light than a night of new moon, and the difference matters when you're on a road in November trying to find your way home. The rhythm of light and dark is woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that most people do not think about it at all. It is simply the shape of days. This is the world you were born into, and it is the only world you have known. It is not a world of misery, though it is a world of difficulty. People laugh in it. They fall in love in it. They feel the particular quiet satisfaction of a day's work completed, and a good supper eaten, and a family sound asleep under a roof that does not leak. They find beauty in the stars over the dark fields, and in the colour of the fire in the hearth, and in the sound of rain on the roof when the hay is already in the barn. But the world makes demands on your body and your attention every single day. And those demands begin before dawn, in the cold, in the dark, with the smell of cold ash in your nose, and the sound of the winter wind in the tree branches beyond the window. The smell of cold ash reaches you first, before your eyes are open. It is a flat mineral smell with a faint trace of smoke in it, the particular scent of a hearth that burned down through the night and has been sitting cold for 4 or 5 hours now. You know from that smell, without thinking it through, that the kitchen will be genuinely cold, that the water in the bucket near the door will have a thin skim of ice on it, that the bread dough you set to rise in the warmest corner of the kitchen last evening will have done about half its work and will need the warmth of a new fire to finish. You know these things before you have fully woken, because your body has been reading this house's signals for long enough that they come to you without effort, the way the smell of rain comes before the rain itself. You push back the quilt, and the cold air finds your arms and your face. The quilt deserves a moment. It was made by your mother, and the backing fabric was woven by her mother on a loom that still stands in the corner of this house. The pattern is called Ohio Star, a name your mother did not know when she made it. She simply called it the star pattern, and it is pieced from the best parts of worn-out things. Dresses that had faded past wearing, work shirts with elbows gone through, the good fabric from a coat that had rotted at the seams. Nothing is wasted in this house if it can be helped, and the quilt is the physical evidence of that principle applied across 20 years of cloth. Under it, you have slept warm enough, the combined warmth of 2 bodies making a kind of cave in the cold room. Outside it, the air is sharp and very still. You reach for the matches on the shelf above the head of the bed. By 1875, friction matches have been available in America for about 40 years, and while they are not expensive, they are not free either, and you have never been careless with them. The matchbox lives on this shelf always, placed there every night without deliberation, because in the dark of a January morning you need to find it without looking. Your fingers close around it, and you draw one match out, and you strike it against the side of the box, and there is a brief flare of sulphur and phosphorus, a sharp chemical smell that cuts through the cold ash smell, and then a small steady flame that shows you the room. The low ceiling, the chest at the foot of the bed, the rag rug your daughter made last winter at her school, the window with its rim of frost. You touch the match flame to the wick of the tallow candle stub on the windowsill. The wick catches, wavers, settles into a small upright flame. A pool of warm yellow light pushes back the dark in a circle about the size of the bed. You cup your hand around the candle and move through the doorway into the kitchen, which is colder than the bedroom by several degrees. The bedroom had the body heat of 2 people sleeping in it to slow its cooling through the night. The kitchen has had nothing. Your breath makes slow clouds in the candlelight as you cross the floor. The hearth is where you go first, and it is always this way, because the mornings in this house are organized around the fire, the way a wheel is organized around its axle. Without fire, nothing else functions, not the breakfast, Not the warm water for washing faces. Not the bread that needs to finish rising. Not the comfort of the room for the children who will come downstairs cold and still half asleep in an hour's time. You crouch at the hearth and feel with your fingers beneath the grey ash for coals. Sometimes there are none, and you begin from scratch. More often, buried deep in the ash where they have been insulated through the night, there are 1 or 2 orange coals still alive. This morning you find 3, banked under the ash like small sleeping embers. You pull the coals forward with the iron poker and rake the dead ash back from around them. Over the coals you arrange a small nest of tinder. Curls of dry birch bark saved from last week's wood splitting. Dried corn husks, a handful of fine dry wood shaved from the bottom of a split log. You lean close and blow, steadily, gently, not too hard, because too much breath smothers a fragile coal, and you know this from 1,000 mornings of practice. The tinder begins to glow orange along its edges. A thread of smoke rises. Then a tiny bright flame catches, leaning sideways in your breath. You lay over it the smallest pieces of kindling, finger-thick sticks of dry oak, crossing them loosely so the air can move between them. The fire takes hold with a soft crackling sound. Once the kindling is burning well, you add the first real wood, split oak logs the size of a man's forearm, dry from the woodshed, the bark still on them on 2 sides. You set 2 on the fire and a third on the side of the hearth to warm before it goes on. The smoke from the new wood draws up the chimney steadily, no backing up, which means the chimney draught is good this morning. The kitchen is beginning to smell of wood smoke. The fire is beginning to push its first warmth into the room, a warmth you feel most in your face when you lean close, a warmth that will spread slowly outward over the next 20 minutes until the kitchen is genuinely comfortable. The water is next. The bucket by the door has a skim of ice across it, and you break it with the handle of the ladle and set it aside to melt in the kitchen's warmth. There is not nearly enough water in the bucket for the morning's requirements. Coffee, the corn mush, water for washing, water for the animals in the barn. The well is 20 paces across the yard, and you take up the larger bucket and your coat and your heavy boots, and you go out into the dark. Outside, the cold is a different thing from the cold inside. It has an openness to it, a freshness. The yard is absolutely dark. There is no moon tonight, and the nearest house is a quarter mile down the road with no lights showing at this hour. But the stars overhead are extraordinary, clear and numerous in the cold air, in a way that they never are in summer. The Milky Way stretches across the southern sky, not a smear but a structure. Individual stars resolving in the steadiness of the cold. You know these stars. You have walked under them your whole life. They tell you the season and the hour in the way that a clock would, if you had occasion to look at one in the night. Your breath comes in slow plumes and drifts. The ground underfoot is frozen solid. The mud ruts from the last thaw in November are now iron-hard ridges that catch your boot toe if you are not careful. You pick your way to the well by feel and memory, shielding the candle flame with your palm. At the well, you lower the bucket, hear the rope play out through the wooden guide, hear the distant heavy plunk of the bucket hitting the water below. The well is still unfrozen. It usually stays open through all but the worst cold snaps, the depth of it keeping the temperature above freezing. You draw the bucket up hand over hand, the rope wet and cold and stiff, the bucket heavy with water, and you carry it back across the dark yard to the kitchen door. The barn comes after the fire is established. You take the barn lantern from its hook beside the kitchen door, light it from the candle, and cross the yard again. The barn door swings heavy and slow on its iron hinges, and as you pull it open, a wave of warm animal air meets your face. The smell of horses and cattle and straw and manure, and the particular sweetness of fermented hay, all layered together into something that has never in your life seemed unpleasant. It is the smell of your mornings. The animals shift and blow at the lantern light, turning their heads. The cow in her stanchion turns to look at you with the calm, dark eyes of a creature that trusts its situation absolutely. The 2 draft horses in their stalls are quiet, their large bodies radiating warmth you can feel from 3 feet away. Warmth they have been generating all night in this closed space. The 6 hens on their roost stir at the light, but do not fully wake. You hang the lantern on its nail, measure out oats for the horses from the grain bin, fork a fresh armful of hay to the cow, scatter corn on the barn floor for the chickens. The water in the stock tank near the barn door is not frozen. You broke the surface yesterday evening, but you check the level and make a note that you will need to carry another bucket before midday. When you come back into the kitchen, a real warmth has arrived. The fire has found its pace and is burning with a steady, measured sound. A low, continuous crackling that is one of the most comfortable sounds in the world when you have been outside in the cold. The iron pot hanging on the crane above the fire is beginning to steam lightly at its lid. The room smells of wood smoke and warming iron, and the first faint anticipation of coffee. You stand for a moment near the hearth, with your hands held toward it, palms out, and feel the heat moving back into your fingers. The tight cold muscles in your face easing. This hour, before the rest of the family wakes, is the best hour. The house is yours, and the fire is going, and the work of the day has a clear shape before you. You pour the coffee grounds into the pot, ground from beans you got at the general store, dark and coarsely ground, measured out by eye, the way you have always done it, and hang the pot on the crane over the fire. The corn mush goes into the smaller pot with water, stirred together with a wooden spoon that has been used for this purpose so long that its bowl is stained the color of old wood. Outside the window, the sky is beginning to change. Not sunrise yet. Sunrise is still a full hour away, but the absolute black of deep winter night has lifted fractionally to a dark blue. You would not notice it if you had not been looking for it, but you have been looking for it for 30 years. The first light of a January morning in Ohio arrives the way most things arrive in this life, gradually, without announcement, as a shift in degree rather than a sudden change of state. By the time you can clearly see the fence posts at the edge of the yard without the lantern, the sky has moved from dark blue to a pale grey blue, and the shapes of things have returned to themselves. The smokehouse, the stone wall along the garden, the dark mass of the bare elm at the south corner of the property. The birds, which have been absolutely silent through the night, begin very quietly. A single crow calling from somewhere in the woodlot, then silence, then 2 or 3 more calling back. The chickens in the barn begin to stir audibly, their soft sounds becoming more frequent as the light reaches even the dim interior. You have watched this particular sequence so many times that you know it the way you know the sound of your children's breathing, not by deciding to know it, but simply because it has been present every morning of your conscious life. The day is fully here now. Everything from this point forward happens in the light. The smell of the fire is the smell of the kitchen, and the smell of the kitchen is the smell of the whole house when the wind is right. Wood smoke and coffee, and the faint yeasty warmth of bread dough, and the iron smell of the cast iron pots on the crane. All of it together is not just a smell, but a condition, a quality of morning, something that means safety and warmth, and the continuation of ordinary life. The cooking hearth in an American farmhouse of 1875 is not a decorative feature. It is infrastructure. It is the machine around which the household runs. Every meal in this house has been cooked at this hearth, over this fire, in these pots for as long as anyone in the family can remember. Breakfast in 1875 is not the same thing as breakfast in any later era. There are no boxes of cereal. There is no refrigerator full of eggs to scramble quickly before work. There is no toaster, no electric kettle, no gas burner that comes on with a click. There is the fire, and there is what you have, and you arrange the two together. This morning's breakfast, like most winter mornings' breakfast, is cornmeal mush, salt pork and coffee. The corn was grown on this land and taken to the grist mill in the fall, and ground into meal that came home in cotton sacks, and now sits in the covered crock on the kitchen shelf. It is coarse ground, yellowish, with a faint smell of the mill still in it. Stirred into boiling water with a little salt, and cooked slowly, stirring often to keep it from sticking to the bottom of the iron pot, it becomes a thick, creamy porridge that fills the stomach and carries you through a cold morning's work in a way that nothing lighter could. The salt pork is from the barrel in the root cellar, and the barrel has been there since last November, when you killed the hog. Pork is the central meat of the American farm diet in this era, and salt pork in particular, cheap, dense with fat, able to survive months in a brine barrel without spoiling, is the meat that shows up in nearly every meal. You slice it thin and lay it in the iron skillet, and it begins to render its fat with a hissing and spitting sound that fills the kitchen with a savoury, rich smell. The fat that comes out of it will be used for the cooking, and then saved in the grease crock beside the fireplace for later use. To season the skillet, to fry eggs when the hens are laying, to grease the bread pans, to soften leather, to make soap at the end of the winter. Nothing is wasted. Nothing. The biscuits are not an everyday thing. On an ordinary weekday morning, there is corn mush, and there is whatever was left from the previous evening's meal, eaten cold or warmed in the skillet. But on days when the work ahead is heavy, or when there are visitors expected, or simply on days when someone in the house has had the energy to think ahead, there are biscuits made in the cast-iron Dutch oven. You mix the flour, wheat flour ground at the mill, white and fine, with lard from the crock and a little salt and a measure of sourdough starter from the crock you have been keeping alive on the kitchen shelf for years. The starter is thick and slightly sour-smelling, and you thin it with a little warm water and stir it into the flour mixture and work it into a soft, shaggy dough with your hands. You pat it out on the floured board and cut circles with the rim of a tin cup, no cutter being available, and lay them in the Dutch oven that has been warming by the fire. The Dutch oven goes onto a bed of coals you pull forward from the main fire, and the lid, which is rimmed to hold coals on top, gets a shovelful of coals piled on it as well, so the heat comes from both above and below. This is the art of hearth baking, managing two sources of heat simultaneously, rotating the Dutch oven every few minutes so the bottom does not scorch on the hot side, adding more coals to the lid as the ones there lose their heat. You have been doing this long enough that you do it without thinking too hard about it, but it requires attention. A moment's distraction and the bottoms blacken, and there are no replacements. The smell of baking biscuits in a warm kitchen on a January morning is a smell that you will not be able to name until you have gone a season without smelling it, at which point you will realize that it was one of the things the good morning smelled like. Coffee in 1875 is a luxury that many American farm families stretch as far as it will go. The beans come from the general store, bought in small quantities because the price is uncertain and the money is never exactly free. Some families roast their own beans in a long-handled iron roaster held over the fire, shaking it to keep the beans turning. Others buy pre-roasted beans and grind them in the small hand-cranked coffee mill mounted on the kitchen wall, a device that makes a grinding, rattling sound and fills the kitchen with the best smell the room produces in any given day. You grind only what you need each morning, because ground coffee loses its flavor faster than whole beans, and because waste of any kind is a habit this house has never acquired. The coffee brews in the iron pot directly on the coals, a long, slow steeping that produces a drink that is strong and dark and slightly bitter, and more necessary than anything else you will drink today. The complexity of hearth cooking is not always visible to people who have never done it. A modern stove has a temperature dial and a timer. The hearth has none of these. What you have instead is a fire that changes in intensity as the wood burns down, a crane that lets you swing pots closer to the coals or further away, a system of iron trivets and pot hooks that allow you to control height above the flame, and the knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of watching fires and tasting food. You know that the mush needs to come off the direct heat and go to the back of the hearth for the last 20 minutes of cooking, or it will scorch on the bottom. You know that the skillet needs to sit flat on the coals and not hang from the crane, because the pork fat needs even heat from below. You know these things the way you know how to walk, without having to think through each step. Preservation is the work that makes winter meals possible, and it happens mostly in the fall, but its effects are felt every single day of the cold months. The root cellar under the kitchen floor is reached by a trapdoor, and it holds the winter's stores. Barrels of salt pork and salt beef, crocks of pickled cucumbers and green tomatoes put up in August, sacks of dried beans, baskets of turnips and carrots, and parsnips packed in sand to keep them from shriveling, a wooden box of apples that are beginning to smell strongly of fermentation now in January. There are dried herbs hanging from the cellar beams, sage and thyme and pennyroyal and tansy, gathered from the garden in summer and dried in bunches in the attic. There are jugs of cider vinegar and maple syrup, and a small keg of molasses that came up from Cincinnati on the river trade last autumn. The garden is not merely a pleasant addition to the household economy in pre-electric America. It is the pharmacy and the pantry together. In summer it produces the vegetables that are dried or pickled or stored for winter. Beans dried in their pods and shelled in long evenings around the fire in October. Corn dried on the ear and ground through November and December. Pumpkins stored in the barn loft. Cabbages made into sauerkraut in a crock that has been producing it since your mother set it up before your marriage. In summer, the garden also provides the medicinal plants. Boneset and catnip for fevers, yarrow to stop bleeding, chamomile for the children's stomachs, lobelia in very small doses for chest complaints. You tend the garden the way you tend any living system that keeps you alive. which is to say with consistent attention and a clear understanding of what depends on it. Eating in pre-electric America is profoundly seasonal in a way that has no equivalent in the modern world. In winter, you eat preserved things, salt meat, dried beans and corn, root vegetables, the last of the stored apples going soft and sweet in their box. In spring, there is maple syrup from the trees at the edge of the woodlot, the first tender greens from the garden by mid-April, eggs from the hens who have begun laying again in the longer light. Summer brings abundance, fresh vegetables, berries, the first green corn, chickens that can be killed and eaten without reducing the winter's laying flock. Fall is the richest season, when everything comes ripe at once, and the work of preservation runs from dawn to dark and beyond for weeks. Winter is the plain season, the lean season, the season of making do with what was put by. You eat what you have. Sunday dinner is the week's climax, the meal that is different from all other meals. If there is a chicken to be killed, one of the older hens past laying well, or a young rooster that was never going to be worth keeping, it comes to the table on Sunday, stewed long and slow in the iron pot with potatoes and onions and thyme from the garden. If there is no chicken, there may be a piece of beef bought from a neighbour who killed a steer in the fall and is selling it off in small lots over the winter, or a ham from the smokehouse, or simply the salt pork made more elaborate with dried apple and a splash of cider vinegar that turns the braising liquid into something almost sweet. Sunday dinner is eaten at noon after church, and it is the meal the children expect, and the meal the week orients itself around. It takes most of the morning to prepare, the kitchen smelling of roasting and simmering, the fire built up larger than on weekdays. The bread is the centre of the week's eating in a more fundamental sense than the Sunday dinner. Bread is made twice a week in most houses, sometimes 3 times if the family is large, or the weather is cold enough that people eat more. The sourdough starter lives in its crock on the kitchen shelf, fed with a little flour and warm water every few days, smelling powerfully yeasty and alive. You take a cup of starter out and mix it with flour and water and salt in the large wooden bowl, and knead the dough on the floured board until it comes smooth and elastic under your hands, and leave it to rise by the fire. If the kitchen is warm enough, it will double in size in 2 hours. If the fire has been low, it may take 4. You have learned to read the dough the way you read the weather, by feel and observation, and a knowledge of its particular character. All of this, the fire management, the preservation system, the bread-making rhythm, the careful stretching of ingredients across the week, happens without written recipes in most households. The knowledge lives in hands and memory, passed from mother to daughter, and occasionally from father to son, accumulated over generations of necessity. There is no cookbook in this kitchen, though there are a few handwritten receipts tucked into the pages of the family Bible, written in the cramped, careful hand of your husband's mother, who learned them from her own mother, and passed them on this way because it was the way such things were passed. You cook by instinct and memory and the smell of things, by the sound of a simmer versus a boil, by the colour of browning fat and the spring of a properly risen loaf. The kitchen is your skill and your domain, and you know it as thoroughly as any craftsman knows his shop. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. The cold has a weight to it when you step outside after breakfast. It presses against your coat and finds the gaps at your wrists and the back of your neck, and moves in with a quiet insistence that makes you pull your collar up and your hat down before you have taken 3 steps from the door. The yard is still in the pale grey light of a January morning that has not quite made up its mind to be fully day yet. The sky is the colour of undyed wool. The trees at the edge of the field are bare and dark and perfectly still. The breath of the horses in the barn makes slow white plumes through the gaps in the boards. This is the shape of winter work, cold light and hard ground, and a long list of tasks that begin before the light and will not be finished until after dark. Wood is the first and most constant concern. A farmhouse in Ohio in January burns through wood at a pace that has to be experienced to be understood. The cooking fire in the kitchen must be kept going from 4 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night. The parlour stove, if one is lit at all, consumes its own wood separately. The bedroom fireplace, rarely used except in the coldest weather when the children are sick and need warmth through the night, takes yet more. An average farm family in the northeastern United States in the 1870s burns between 15 and 25 cords of wood per year, depending on the severity of the winter and the efficiency of their fireplaces and stoves. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. The cutting and splitting and stacking of that much wood is one of the central physical occupations of the year. You split wood in the early morning before the light is fully up, when the cold makes the oak split cleanly. The splitting maul is a heavy iron tool with a long hickory handle, worn smooth where your hands have gripped it for years. You set a log upright on the chopping block, a thick section of elm cut low and broad, and strike with the maul in a swing that comes from the shoulder and the whole turning of the torso, not from the arms alone. The log splits with a sound like a small door slamming, and the 2 pieces fall away on either side. You set each piece in turn and split again. The rhythm of it is regular and almost meditative. The lift, the swing, the crack, the 2 pieces falling, the next log set. Wood smoke smelling cold air. The ringing of iron on wood and wood on the frozen ground. The livestock need attention at least twice a day, and in cold weather more often. The horses must be fed and watered, and their stalls mucked out. The soiled straw forked into the manure pile at the back of the barn, and fresh bedding forked in from the straw stack. The cow must be milked, twice a day without fail, morning and evening never skipped, and her stall cleaned in the same way. The hogs in their pen at the side of the barn must be fed kitchen scraps and ground corn and water that has not frozen. The chickens need feed scattered in the morning and their water changed because it freezes solid in the night. The barn cat, who earns her place by keeping the mouse population under control in the grain bins, gets a tin of kitchen scraps and a pat on the head. The hogs occupy a particular position in the pre-electric farm economy. They are not pets, and they are not merely livestock in the abstract. They are the year's meat supply, the difference between having salt pork in the barrel through February or not. You keep 2 or 3 hogs through the summer, feeding them table scraps and ground corn and whey from the cheese-making and anything else edible that the household produces and does not consume. By November they are heavy and well fed, and the killing is done in cold weather so the meat will not spoil before it can be processed, typically in late November or early December, on a day when the temperature stays below freezing. The whole process, from killing to salting and packing the pork barrel, takes 2 full days and requires help from neighbours. What comes from it sustains the family through the winter months in a way that nothing else quite does. The cow is a different kind of essential. A good dairy cow in 1875 produces somewhere between 3 and 5 gallons of milk per day in her peak season, less in winter when her feed is dried hay and corn rather than fresh pasture. From that milk the household takes what it needs for drinking and for cooking, and the surplus, the cream that rises, is skimmed off each morning and set in the cold of the cellar to accumulate for butter. Butter making happens once or twice a week. The cream goes into the wooden churn, and you work the dasher up and down in long, rhythmic strokes, sometimes for 30 minutes, sometimes for an hour, until the fat separates from the buttermilk and forms into yellow butter granules that you gather and work together with a little salt and press into a mold. Butter is not merely a food. It is a product you can sell or trade at the general store, a form of cash that comes reliably from the cow's daily output. Winter in the barn is different from summer in the barn. In summer, the horses are out in the pasture from midday. The cow is in the meadow. The chickens range free. The barn itself is empty and open and smells of old hay and sun-warmed boards. In winter, the barn is closed and full and alive. The animal's breath warms the interior to 10 or 15 degrees above the outside temperature, and the smell of bodies and manure and fermented hay is dense and strong. You spend more time in the barn in winter than in summer because the animals cannot care for themselves, and because the barn is one of the warmer places on the property. Repairs are done in the barn in winter, harness mended, tools sharpened and handles replaced, fencing material cut and stacked ready for spring. The women's work of the farm in winter runs parallel to the men's work and is no less demanding, though it is conducted almost entirely indoors. The kitchen is the centre of it, cooking and baking and preserving on whatever scale winter allows, but also the work of making and mending cloth. Spinning was the occupation of winter evenings in earlier generations, and by 1875 it has diminished somewhat, because factory-spun yarn and cloth are available and not impossibly expensive. But mending remains constant. Every piece of fabric in the house is kept in service until it is genuinely worn past repair. And keeping it in service means weekly attention to loose seams, worn elbows, fraying cuffs, holes in the heels of socks. A woman with a family in this era might spend 3 or 4 hours a day at needlework of some kind, the basket of mending beside the chair a permanent presence in the kitchen. Monday is wash day. This is not a custom or a preference. It is a near-universal practice in American households of this era, so standardized that if you asked any housewife in the county when she did the washing, she would look at you with mild puzzlement and say, "Monday," as if the question were slightly strange. Wash day begins before sunrise with heating water, gallons and gallons of it. Because washing in 1875 is a water-intensive process, the large iron kettle, which lives outside the kitchen door in summer and is moved to the hearth in winter, is filled and brought to a boil. The clothes and linens are sorted. Whites first, then colours, then the heavily soiled work clothes last, so the cleanest things go through the water before it is too dirty to do any good. Each item is scrubbed on the washboard, a corrugated zinc or glass board set in a wooden frame, and the scrubbing requires real physical force. You lean into it with your knuckles and your forearms, working the fabric against the ridges to loosen the dirt. The washboard is followed by rinsing, at least 1 rinse, ideally 2, and then wringing the water out of each piece, which is done by hand for smaller items, and for the larger things requires a wooden mangle, or the help of a second person, each taking an end of a twisted sheet and pulling in opposite directions to force the water out. In summer, the wet laundry goes on the line in the yard and dries in a few hours in the sun. In January, the problem is different. Clothes hung outside in January will freeze before they dry, which means they must either be dried by the fire indoors, draped on chairs and the backs of the kitchen settee, and on a wooden rack that unfolds for the purpose. Or you wait for a cold but dry day with wind, hang them out anyway. Bring them in stiff as boards, and let them finish drying inside. The kitchen on Monday afternoon smells of wet wool and soap lye and steam, and it stays damp warm until the last piece is dry. The children work. This is not incidental or occasional. The children of the farm family in 1875 are expected to contribute to the household's functioning from the time they are old enough to carry a bucket without spilling it, which is about age 5. The younger children carry kindling and fetch water and feed the chickens and carry messages between parts of the property. The older children take on increasingly substantial work. The 12-year-old daughter who is expert at the butter churn, the 14-year-old son who can split wood as fast as his father, and has been mucking out the cow's stall every morning for 3 years. The work is calibrated to capacity. No one asks a 7-year-old to do what a 12-year-old does, but the expectation that everyone in the household contributes according to their ability is so deeply embedded in the culture of the farm that it is not thought of as an imposition at all. It is simply the structure of the life. The day's work in winter has a shape determined largely by the light. You push hard through the morning hours, while the light is growing and the cold is at its worst, getting the heaviest physical work done early. By midday, the light is at its best, and the temperature has risen slightly. And you take your noon meal, dinner, in the vocabulary of the era, not lunch, lunch being a word associated with city people and snacking, back in the kitchen, the fire built up, the table set. The afternoon work is lighter, or requires less light, mending harness, sharpening tools, doing the accounts if there are accounts to do, checking on the livestock a second time, cutting more wood and stacking it in the woodshed where it will be protected from snow. By 3 o'clock in January, the light is already declining, and by 4 it is dusky, and by 5 it is night. Doing the accounts is a task that gets done on a slow afternoon in January, when the outdoor work has been completed, and the light is still adequate to read by. The farm's finances are kept in a small ledger, a narrow notebook with a cardboard cover, bought at the general store and filled with pencil figures written in a careful, slightly laboured hand. On one side are the income entries: the cord of wood sold to the schoolhouse in November, the eggs sold to the store through October, the bushels of wheat taken to the mill in September and converted to flour, and the surplus sold. On the other side are the expenditures: the kerosene, the store credit drawn down for fabric and tools and coffee and salt, the blacksmith's bill from when the big horse threw a shoe in October. The arithmetic is not complicated, but it is consequential, and it is done carefully. The pencil moved slowly down the columns, the totals checked twice. The farm does not run on a surplus in most years. It runs on a careful management of the margin between what comes in and what goes out, a margin that is sometimes comfortable and sometimes very thin, and that requires attention throughout the year to keep from becoming a deficit that carries over into the next season. The smell of the house is its own kind of fact, a combination of things so familiar that you stop noticing it long before you are 10 years old, but that would be immediately distinct to any visitor crossing the threshold for the first time. Wood smoke is the top note. You could not remove it if you tried. It has worked itself into the plaster and the wood and the fabric over years of fires. Under it is the smell of cooked food, of frying fat and boiling corn mush, and the yeasty warmth of bread, of coffee and salt pork. Under that is the deeper smell of the house itself, the raw wood of the floors, the lime in the plaster, the lanolin in the wool blankets on the stairs, the faint mineral smell of cold stone from the hearth in rooms away from the fire. And underneath all of it, so familiar as to be imperceptible, the smell of the family that lives here, soap and skin, and the particular warmth of sleeping children. The farmhouse itself in 1875 is not the idealized version of such a place that appears in later picture books and calendars. It is a practical object built to house people and protect them from the weather, and it shows the evidence of that purpose in every detail. The kitchen, which is the largest room always, has a ceiling low enough to retain heat efficiently. Dark wood beams running across it, the plaster between the beams stained yellow-brown from years of wood smoke. The floor is wide pine boards, worn smooth in the paths of most frequent travel, and rough at the edges near the walls, where the broom rarely reaches. The windows are small by modern standards. Glass was expensive, and glass that let in the wind was worse than no glass at all, and the panes are slightly wavy and full of tiny bubbles, the marks of hand-blown glass. The furniture in the kitchen is sparse and functional and almost entirely made of wood. The table at the centre of the room is a long, heavy piece of pine, scarred from years of use, no finish on it now. Whatever finish it once had wore off long ago and was never replaced. Around it are wooden chairs, not matched, accumulated over years of use and repair and replacement, each one slightly different in height and age. Against the wall is a wooden settle, a long bench with a high back that blocks the draught from the door when someone sits in it, functional as a bench, but also as a storage chest when the seat lifts. Along the wall near the hearth are the kitchen shelves holding the crocks and jars and tins, the flour barrel, the coffee mill, the candle mould, the tin cups, the wooden bowls. The parlour, if the house has one, and not all farmhouses do, the two-room farmhouse of the kitchen and the sleeping room being not uncommon, is a different kind of space. It is the formal room, the room for company, the room that represents the family's best aspirations about itself. In it are the nicer pieces of furniture, a horsehair sofa, dark and stiff, from a city store, a rocking chair with a cushioned seat made from a fabric that matches nothing else in the house, but was chosen because it was beautiful. A what-not shelf in the corner holding the family's decorative objects. A pressed glass vase, a china figurine of a shepherd that came from Germany with your grandmother, a daguerreotype of your husband's parents in an oval frame. The parlour fireplace is never lit except in cold weather when there is genuine company, and the room is cold and slightly damp most of the winter. Smelling of the horsehair in the sofa and the dust that settles on the what-not shelf between one cleaning and the next. Heating in a pre-electric farmhouse is a subject that the people who live in such a house think about constantly, from October through March, in a way that people with central heating systems never have to. The kitchen fireplace heats the kitchen. The parlour fireplace, when lit, heats the parlour. The bedrooms are heated by nothing, or, in the coldest weather, by small fireplaces that are only lit when someone is sick, because the cost in wood and attention is judged too high for nightly use. You sleep cold. You wake cold. The cold is not an emergency. It is a normal condition that you mitigate with quilts and body heat and the rapid re-establishment of the kitchen fire first thing in the morning. The iron box stoves that were becoming common by the 1870s, fired by coal or wood, and radiating heat in all directions rather than only in the direction they face, are a significant improvement over the open hearth for heating purposes, and many families have added one to the kitchen by this period. The Franklin stove, or box stove, or parlour stove, the terminology varies by region and by the stove's exact design, is cast iron and squat and efficient in a way the open fireplace is not. A fireplace radiates roughly 20% of its heat into the room and sends the rest up the chimney. A good cast-iron stove radiates more than twice that, its whole exterior surface hot, its heat dispersing into the room in all directions rather than only toward whatever is in front of it. If the family has been able to add such a stove to the kitchen in January is genuinely warm all the way to the corners. If they have not, the kitchen is warm near the fire, and noticeably cooler toward the door and the window, and there are cold spots along the floor where the winter air seeps under the door no matter how carefully you have packed rags against the gap. Light, after warmth, is the other great domestic problem of the pre-electric house. The candle held the field for centuries, and by the 1870s it has been largely supplemented by the kerosene lamp, which gives a steadier and brighter light than even the best beeswax candle. The standard kerosene lamp of the 1870s is a glass reservoir on a metal base with a flat wick that draws kerosene up through capillary action and burns at the top, surrounded by a glass chimney that protects the flame from drafts and directs the heat upward, which in turn draws more air up from below and makes the flame burn more cleanly. A good kerosene lamp gives off enough light to read by when you are sitting close to it. About the equivalent of a 40-watt incandescent bulb by modern reckoning, though the comparison is imperfect because the quality of lamplight is different from electric light, yellower, warmer, flickering slightly, alive in a way that electric light is not. The lamp needs maintenance. The wick must be trimmed regularly. It chars at the top as it burns, and the charred material must be cut away with scissors each morning, or the flame will be smoky and uneven. The chimney must be wiped clean of the black soot that accumulates on its inner surface during a night of burning, using a twisted paper wick or a small rag on a stick. The reservoir must be refilled from the kerosene supply, a jug kept by the kitchen door, refilled from a barrel in the woodshed, and the process of refilling is done carefully because kerosene splashed on the table or the floor and not cleaned up is a fire risk. The lamp sits on the table or on the kitchen shelf, or is carried from room to room as needed, a pool of moving light that goes where you go and illuminates whatever you are looking at while leaving everything else in shadow. The sounds of the house after dark are quite different from its daytime sounds. During the day there is the constant noise of family life. Voices, footsteps, the clank of the kitchen work, the sound of the children at their lessons or their play, the outdoor sounds coming through the windows and doors when they are opened. After dark, when the family has eaten and settled to their evening occupations, the house quiets to a different register. There is the steady voice of the fire. There is the tick of the clock on the parlour shelf, a wooden mantel clock that was wound on Sunday evenings and keeps reasonably good time through the week. There is the sound of the wind moving around the corners of the house when the weather is up. A low, complicated sound that is different on each side of the house, and that you have learned to interpret as weather sign. There is the sound of the house's own settling, the creak of timbers adjusting to the cold, the tick of the stove cooling if the fire has been banked. The house stores things with the efficiency of any space that must contain a family's entire life. The loft above the kitchen holds dried herbs hanging from the beams. strings of dried apple rings looped on nails, sacks of seed corn saved from the summer's best ears, the extra quilts in summer and the summer clothes in winter. The root cellar holds the winter's food supply. The woodshed holds the winter's fuel. The barn holds the animals and their feed and the farm's tools and the summer's machinery. The house proper holds the family, which means its spaces are used with an economy that leaves nothing idle. The space under the bed holds a trundle bed for the youngest child. The top of the corner cupboard holds the Sunday dishes. The drawer of the kitchen table holds the family's small tools, the darning needles and the scissors and the pencil stub and the small notebook where your husband keeps his accounts. Among all the strictly functional objects in the house, there are a small number of things that are there for no practical reason, or for reasons that are practical only in the sense that human beings need objects that carry meaning. On the kitchen wall, between the window and the shelf of crocks, hangs a needlework sampler in a thin wooden frame. It was made by your wife when she was 11 years old, stitched in wool on linen, the alphabet and the numerals, and a small house and 2 trees, and her name and the year, 1859, in red thread that has faded to a soft brown. The stitchwork is uneven in places, the letters slightly crowded on the right side where she ran short of room. And these imperfections are part of what makes it irreplaceable. On the parlour shelf beside the clock sits the shepherd figurine from Germany. The one your husband's grandmother carried across the Atlantic in a cloth bag packed with wool to cushion it. The one that has survived the journey and 2 generations of children in the house without losing so much as a crook from the shepherd's staff. These objects have no use. They are the house's claim to being more than a functional shelter. Its claim to being the place where a specific family has lived and accumulated the evidence of living. At the end of the day, the house looks very much as it does at the beginning. The fire is lower but still alive. The kitchen is warm, the dishes are put away, the children are in bed, the parlour is dark and cold. The woodbox by the hearth has been restocked for the morning. Everything in this house is in its place, and the place of everything is known, because in the dark, in the middle of the night, if you need to cross the kitchen or find the matches or get to a sick child, you do it by the map you carry in your head of every inch of this space. The house is not merely a shelter. It is a system, a technology, a set of relationships between people and fire and food and weather that has been refined through daily practice for as long as the family has been here. The weight of winter clothes in 1875 is something that has to be put on to be understood. Everything you wear in January is heavy. The wool of the men's work trousers is a dense, tightly woven broadcloth that holds its warmth even when wet, a fabric that smells slightly of lanolin on warm days and develops a particular stiffness in the cold, a stiffness you warm out of it simply by wearing it for the first hour of the morning. The flannel shirt under the coat is a softer wool, napped on the surface, thick enough to be genuinely warm on its own. The coat is wool too, a sack coat in a dark colour. Dark because dark colours show the dirt less, and because the dye was cheaper, with a lining of cheaper cotton fabric that has worn shiny at the elbows from years of use. Socks are wool, knitted by hand from yarn that was carded and spun in this house or bought at the dry goods store. Everything that touches your skin is heavy and warm and slightly coarse. For women, the weight of clothing is greater still. The dress is the outer garment, and a dress in 1875 is not the light single layer that the word might suggest. There is a chemise beneath everything, a loose, simple cotton shift that is the garment closest to the skin, and the one most frequently washed, because the others are harder to launder. Over the chemise goes a pair of drawers, cotton in summer and wool or heavy cotton flannel in winter. Over that goes the corset, worn by most women above a certain social aspiration, though on working farms practicality often wins, and the corset is loosened or set aside for the hardest work, which is a boned or stiffened garment that shapes the torso and against which everything else is fitted. Over the corset goes a petticoat, sometimes two in cold weather, full-skirted, wool in winter. Over the petticoats goes the dress itself. The dress on an ordinary farm woman in Ohio in 1875 is a practical garment made by herself or by the seamstress in the county seat, fitted at the bodice with buttons up the front. Hooks and eyes on the back closure are also common, and full-skirted with enough room to move and work and bend and carry. The fabric is a wool-cotton blend called linsey-woolsey if it is homespun, or a printed cotton if it is factory-made, and the colours are the durable, slightly muted tones that hold up through repeated washing. Dark blue, brown, wine red, dark green. There are no bright colours in the everyday wardrobe of the working farm. Bright colours fade, and faded colours look shabby. And looking shabby is a different thing from being poor, which is a distinction the farm family maintains with considerable care. The Sunday clothes are a separate category. They live in the wooden chest in the parlour bedroom, wrapped in old muslin to keep the dust off, and they come out once a week, and for funerals, and for the occasional visit to town. The difference between the Sunday dress and the weekday dress is not always one of fabric. Sometimes it is the same wool serge, bought in quantity, but of finish and care. The Sunday dress has been pressed with the flat iron heated on the coals, and it shows no darning, or at least none in visible places. The Sunday shoes are blacked and buffed. The hair is done more carefully. There is a ritual to Sunday dressing, a marking of the day as different from all other days, that has significance beyond the purely practical, and touches something in the family about continuity and self-respect, and the maintenance of standards even when no one outside the household would necessarily know whether they were being maintained or not. Boots are the single most important article of clothing on a working farm in the 19th century. And the quality of your boots determines, in a more immediate way than almost any other single factor, how comfortable your working life is going to be. A good pair of boots in 1875, calfskin uppers, stacked leather sole, square-toed with a low heel reaching to mid-calf, costs between $3 and $5 at the shoe store, which represents several days' wages for a hired labourer and is a significant purchase for a farm family. Good boots are resoled when the soles wear through, because a new pair is expensive, and a few cents worth of cobbler's work can extend their life by another year. You grease your boots with tallow or neatsfoot oil to keep the leather supple in the cold, because stiff leather cracks at the flex point over the toes and a cracked boot lets water in, and a boot that lets water in is worse than no protection at all. Mending is the constant companion of clothing in this era. Nothing in the house is discarded while any part of it remains useful. And the process of keeping clothing in service, patching knees, replacing worn cuffs, darning holes in wool socks, reattaching buttons, reinforcing seams that have pulled loose under the stress of hard physical work, is an occupation that takes up hours of every week. The mending basket is always present in the kitchen, a willow basket set beside the chair nearest the fire, full of socks turned inside out to show the hole, shirts with collars detached for turning, a pair of the boy's trousers with a knee worn through, that needs a patch cut from the fabric of a garment too far gone for anything else. Mending is often done in the evenings by lamplight. It requires enough light to see the stitches, but is fine enough work to be done sitting still, which makes it well suited to the hours after supper. The Singer sewing machine had been in American households since the early 1850s, and by 1875 it is a common possession in farm households that can afford the $30 or $40 it costs, which is not all of them, but a growing number. The treadle-operated machine worked by the foot rocking the wide iron treadle while the hands guide the fabric, can stitch a long seam in a fraction of the time it takes to do the same seam by hand, and its stitches are more consistent. Dressmaking, the making of new garments from purchased fabric or from the recycled cloth of worn-out things, is made significantly faster and easier by the machine, and in households that have one, more garments are made and more quickly. But the machine does not replace hand sewing entirely. The finishing of seams, the sewing of buttons, the making of buttonholes, the hemming, the mending, all of this is still done by hand, the needle and the thimble still necessary tools in any woman's workbasket. Children's clothing in 1875 is largely cut-down adult clothing. The principle of making do with what is available applies nowhere more clearly than in the dressing of children, who grow quickly and are hard on their clothes, and whose needs for garments cannot always be met from the budget available. A man's worn-out shirt becomes a boy's shirt, with the sleeves shortened and the collar reset. A woman's faded dress becomes two little girls' pinafores and a curtain. The good fabric from a coat that has rotted at the seams becomes a pair of small trousers for a 4-year-old. There is a craft to this, an art of looking at a worn garment and seeing not what it has been, but what it can become, and it is a skill that the women of the household develop early and practice throughout their lives. Laundry is the hardest domestic labor of the week, and it deserves to be understood in its full physical reality. The water must be heated to near boiling, and heating water in quantity means maintaining a large fire for 2 or more hours in the morning while the kettles heat. The scrubbing of the clothing on the washboard is work that uses the forearms, the shoulders, the back, the whole upper body in repetitive motion for as long as it takes to get through the pile, which on a family-sized wash could be 3 or 4 hours. The rinsing requires more water and more carrying. The wringing requires strength, and for the larger pieces, 2 people. The drying in January requires strategy and luck. The flat irons, 2 or 3 of them, each a solid block of iron with a cast handle, weighing several pounds, are heated on the fire or the stove surface and tested for temperature by the quick method of spitting on the sole plate and watching how the droplet behaves, or the more careful method of holding the iron near the cheek to feel its heat. Too cool, and it will not press the wrinkles out. Too hot, and it will scorch the fabric, leaving a brown triangle mark that does not come out. The correct temperature is a judgment call that you develop through years of practice. You iron the Sunday dress on Saturday afternoon, the flat irons going back to the heat source every few minutes as they cool, each one swapped for the next hot one in sequence. The smell of hot-pressed wool fills the kitchen for an hour. The finished garment hangs from a hook near the ceiling to air, before being folded and put away. The apron is the garment that most clearly marks the transition between the domestic interior and the world outside it, and it is as much a part of a working woman's daily dress as her shoes. She puts it on first thing in the morning, when she comes down to start the fire, and she takes it off last when the evening's work is done and the family has settled to its quiet. The apron in 1875 is a large garment, not the decorative half-apron of later domestic fantasy, but a full-length piece of heavy cotton or sticking that covers the front of the dress from collar to hem, tied at the waist with long strings that go twice around and fasten in front. It is there to protect the dress from the splatters of cooking fat, the smears of bread dough, the water from the wash, the streaks of ash from the hearth. When the apron is dirty beyond a morning's wearing, it is changed for a fresh one. There are 3 or 4 in the house at any given time, in various stages of cleanliness, and the dirty one goes into the wash. The apron is changed when company comes. An upgrade to the cleaner one, hanging on the hook by the stairs, that is kept for this purpose. These small refinements of presentation in a world where most of life is physically demanding are not vanity. They are the maintenance of standards, the daily assertion that difficulty and dirt are not the same thing. What the pre-electric world understood about clothing, and what is less immediately obvious to people who live in a world of cheap disposable fabric, is that cloth was valuable. Not just in the abstract, in the daily, practical sense that a piece of good wool or cotton had been produced by a chain of labour that stretched from the shearing or the picking to the carding to the spinning to the weaving to the cutting to the sewing, and that the labour at each stage represented real time and real effort. Waste was not merely economically imprudent, it was morally weighted. You wore things out, and then used the remnants, and then burned the last scraps for kindling, and at no point in that sequence did you feel that anything had been squandered. This relationship with material objects, the careful use, the repair, the second and third life of things, is one of the most fundamental and least examined differences between that world and this one. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. The sound of children in a farmhouse in 1875 is different from the sound of children in later eras in ways that are difficult to articulate, but immediately perceptible. It is partly the absence of certain modern sounds. No television, no recorded music, no electronic toys. But it is also something more substantive. The children of the pre-electric farm are present in the adult world of the house in a way that later children would not be, because the household needs them there. They are not separated from the adult's work and sent to play in another room. They are participants in the morning routine before they have finished waking up, carrying the kindling, holding the door, watching how the fire is built and storing that knowledge away. They are apprenticed to the life of the house from the time they can walk steadily. Babies are born at home. There is no hospital within practical reach, and even if there were, the culture of childbirth in rural America in 1875 is still firmly domestic. The birth happens in the bedroom, attended by the midwife if one is available within a reasonable distance, by a neighbour woman with experience if not, and by the mother's own mother if she is living nearby. The father waits somewhere, in the kitchen, in the barn, wherever he has been told to go, and the women manage the birth. If everything goes well, the baby is washed and swaddled and placed in the cradle beside the fire, and the mother rests in her bed, and the household reorganizes around the new member's needs. If things do not go well, the possibilities available are limited. The 1875 infant mortality rate in the United States is roughly 160 per thousand live births. 1 child in 6 will not survive to age 5. This is a fact known by every family, an arithmetic of loss that shapes the way children are spoken of and thought about. The death of children in pre-electric America is not merely a statistical phenomenon, but a regular presence in the emotional life of nearly every family. Most parents of the era can name a child they buried, or remember the burial of a sibling, or know a neighbour who lost 2 or 3 children in a single season to diphtheria, or scarlet fever, or the summer complaint, as infantile diarrhea was often called. The family Bible on the parlour shelf carries evidence of this in its pages. The birth and death dates recorded in careful ink. Some of the death dates only weeks or months after the birth dates. Small lives that occupy a single line. The practice of photographing dead children, called post-mortem photography, a common Victorian custom, speaks to the intensity with which these brief lives were grieved and remembered. Children were loved in this era with a tenderness that coexisted with, and was perhaps made more intense by, the knowledge of how quickly they could be lost. The working lives of children begin early and expand steadily as they grow. A 5-year-old carries small burdens, a single stick of kindling at a time, a handful of corn for the chickens, a message between the house and the barn. A 7-year-old is expected to understand and follow a sequence of tasks without being reminded of each step. A 10-year-old can manage the chickens and carry a full bucket of water and help with the washing up and watch the younger children while the adults are occupied. A 12-year-old can cook a basic meal and churn butter and assist with the milking and do many of the routine farm tasks with only occasional oversight. A 14-year-old is essentially a junior adult, capable of managing a significant portion of the household's work and expected to do so. School is the partial exception to this pattern of continuous work, but only partial. The one-room schoolhouse that serves your county district is within walking distance, 2 miles give or take, and you walked it yourself as a child, and your oldest children walk it now. But school in pre-electric rural America does not run the full year in a single unbroken stretch the way modern schools do. There is typically a winter term, running from late November or December through February, when farm labour is at its lowest demand and children can be spared from their work. There is a summer term, shorter, running from May to July, that serves the younger children and girls, who are less needed in the fields than older boys at summer peak. The fall harvest keeps older children home for weeks at a time, regardless of school scheduling, because the crop will not wait, and bodies available to bring it in take priority over lessons. The schoolhouse is one room, heated by an iron stove in the centre that the older boys take turns feeding wood to, and it contains children ranging from age 6 to 16, all being taught simultaneously by a single teacher who is typically a young woman earning $30 a term, living in the household of a local family who board her in exchange for a reduction in their school taxes. The curriculum is the McGuffey Eclectic Reader in its various levels, a series of reading textbooks that are also moral instruction and also literature and also civics, and that a large proportion of American children of this era are educated on. They teach reading by having children read aloud, pronunciation corrected by the teacher who walks between the rows. They teach arithmetic with slates, small blackboards in wooden frames, on which the children work problems and then hold up for the teacher's inspection. The older children help teach the younger ones when the teacher is occupied elsewhere, a practice that has educational value for the teacher as well as the taught. Play for children in pre-electric America is a thing that happens in the margins of work, rather than in dedicated time set aside for it. The summer evenings, after the day's work is done and before dark drives everyone inside, are the closest thing to unstructured playtime that most farm children have, and even then the eldest daughter is watching the youngest child, and the eldest son is checking on the animals. The games they play are simple and require no equipment. Running games, hiding games, the kinds of rhyming and singing games that girls played in circles. Marbles, carved from clay or cut from stone, are passed from older children to younger ones, and can be played in the road ruts or in the clean-swept barn floor. In winter, snow provides sled runs on the hill at the back of the property, and the children's small figures are visible from the kitchen window on a Saturday afternoon, going up and down the slope in the grey winter light. The relationship between parents and children in 1875 is not the relationship described in later parenting literature. There is not much theorizing about childhood in this household. There is enormous practical love, worry about health, care during illness, attention to food and warmth and safety. But it is expressed in action rather than in the language of feelings. And the expectation of obedience is both clear and constant. A child who does not do as he is told creates real problems in a household where the work is essential and the help is necessary. Discipline is physical when it occurs, a matter of course rather than a matter of debate, and while later generations will judge this harshly, within its own context, it is part of a system of expectation and responsibility that most children in it understand and navigate. The evenings are the time that most resembles what later generations would call family time. After supper, after the dishes are done, the family gathers in the kitchen around the lamp and the fire. The father reads from the Bible on Sundays and holy days, from the almanac on ordinary evenings, occasionally from a newspaper that has come from the county seat a few days after printing. The mother sews or mends with the lamp pulled close to her work. The older children do their lessons on slates at the kitchen table, occasionally asking a question that gets answered briefly. The younger children play quietly on the floor near the fire, or begin to drowse in their chairs. It is not exciting. It is not meant to be exciting. It is the ending of the day, the gathering before the dispersal to the cold beds. An hour or so of being together in the warm room before the lamp is turned low and the family climbs the stairs. Bedtime for the children comes early, by 7 o'clock in winter, sometimes earlier for the youngest. The routine is simple. The younger ones get their faces and hands washed with a cloth dipped in the water on the warming stone near the fire, their night clothes pulled over their heads, their prayers said kneeling on the cold floor of the kitchen with small hands clasped and eyes shut. Then they are carried or walked upstairs to the bedroom, where the trundle bed is already pulled out from under the big bed and the quilts folded back. The room is cold. It has not been heated since the fire in the kitchen warmed the adjacent wall, and that warmth does not reach far. The children are tucked in quickly, and you lean over the smallest one for a moment, feeling the warmth of her small head under your hand, the soft sound of her breathing. And then you pull the quilt up to her chin and carry the candle back to the stairs. The teaching of domestic skills in a pre-electric household is not a formal curriculum. It happens alongside the work itself, a child standing at her mother's elbow for years, before she's given responsibility for any part of the process, then given a small part, then a larger one, until the knowledge has transferred without any single moment that could be identified as the lesson. The first time your daughter made bread on her own, entirely on her own, from the measuring of the flour to the kneading, to the shaping to the watching of the oven, she was 12 years old, and you stood near enough to intervene if needed, but did not intervene, and the loaves that came out of the Dutch oven were slightly dense and a little uneven in shape, but they were bread, and they were hers. And the look on her face when she turned them out onto the board was the same look any craftsman wears when a piece comes out right. This is how the knowledge travels, not through books or formal instruction, but through presence and repetition, and the gradual expansion of responsibility until the student has become, without quite noticing the transition, a practitioner. The cradle beside the kitchen fire holds the youngest member of the household, the one too small to have made it upstairs yet, the one whose needs in the night are frequent enough that it makes more sense to have it near the warmth and near you. The cradle is wooden, curved on the base so it rocks with a push, worn smooth on its sides where many hands have rocked it over many years. The sound of a baby sleeping in a cradle, the small, quick breath, the occasional small sound that is not quite a cry, is a sound that fills the background of the kitchen evening, in a way that, once it has been part of the sound of your life, its absence is immediately noticeable when the child grows too large for the cradle and moves upstairs to share a bed with the others. The kitchen is quieter then. The evenings change their quality slightly. The house moves through time this way. Children in the cradle, and then children upstairs, and then children grown and gone, and the cradle empty in the corner. And you notice each shift. The distance between farmhouses in rural Ohio in 1875 is typically 1/4 to a half mile, which seems short until you consider that this distance is travelled on foot or on horseback through mud or snow, or the particular combination of mud and frozen ruts that characterizes a late February day when the thaw has begun but not finished. Neighbours are not background figures in the pre-electric rural world. They are infrastructure. The relationships between neighbouring families, maintained through years of small exchanges, loans, shared labour, mutual assistance in crisis, are as essential to survival as the woodshed full of fuel or the barrels in the root cellar. A family that has fallen into bad relations with its neighbours in 1875 is a family that is genuinely more vulnerable to difficulty than one that has not. The general store is the social centre of the community in a way that has no single modern equivalent. It is the post office, the news exchange, the place where credit is negotiated and accounts settled and gossip traded, the place where you learn that the Johnson child has been sick for 2 weeks, and that the Hendersons are looking to sell their East 40 acres, and that a new family has moved into the old Mortimer place down the road. The storekeeper, in a community of this size, knows the financial situation of every family he extends credit to, which is most of them, and this knowledge gives him a particular and somewhat uncomfortable position in the community, trusted and necessary and slightly resented all at once. The store smells of coffee beans and molasses, and pickles from the open barrel by the door, and the coal oil in the lamps overhead, and the tobacco that the men chew and sometimes smoke while they stand around the stove when there is no work pressing. The post office, which in most small communities is a corner of the general store, or a small separate room attached to it, is the community's connection to the world beyond what you can see from your own porch. Letters arrive and are held for pickup. There is no door-to-door delivery in rural areas yet, and you come to the store to collect your mail when you have occasion to be there. A letter from a relative in a distant state is a significant event, read and reread and discussed at the supper table, and sometimes read aloud to neighbours who are visiting. News of what is happening in Washington, in the cities, in the wider country comes slowly and intermittently. The weekly county newspaper, carried by whatever conveyance, brings it from the printing press, sometimes several days old by the time you read it. The world beyond your immediate county is known, but distantly, filtered through the inevitable delay of paper and horse. Church on Sunday morning is as much a social event as a religious one, though no one in the community would frame it that way. You put on your Sunday clothes, and you harness the horse to the buggy or the wagon. the wagon in winter because the buggy's lighter wheels break through frozen ruts. And you drive the 2 or 3 miles to the church, the same white clapboard building that your family has attended for 2 generations, the same graves in the churchyard where your parents and your husband's parents rest under simple stone markers that are already beginning to go green with lichen. You arrive a little early because arriving early gives you time to speak with the neighbours before the service begins. And the 15 minutes before the minister takes the pulpit are the most socially active of the week. Who is there? Who is absent and why? Who is looking well and who is not? The barn raising is the community's most visible act of collective labour, and one of the most important demonstrations of how interdependence works in practice. When a farmer needs a new barn, his old one burned or became too small or simply fell past the point of repair, he does not hire contractors. He gathers his neighbours. The timbers are cut and prepared beforehand by the owner and whoever helped him through the winter. On the appointed day, which is typically a Saturday in May or June when the work of planting is done and the weather is reliably good, 30 or 40 men from the surrounding farms arrive at sunrise with their tools and their workbox lunches. They raise the frame of a barn in a single day by working together. The heavy timbers swung up with ropes and muscle, the mortise and tenon joints driven home with wooden mallets, the whole structure going from a pile of timber to a standing skeleton in the course of a long summer's day. The women cook for this event on a scale proportional to the number of workers. The meal at noon is a farm dinner spread on boards set on sawhorses in the yard, cold meats and potato salads and pickles and bread and pie, enough to feed 40 working men. The quilting bee is the women's equivalent of the barn raising, a gathering around a piece of work that is too large for one person to complete efficiently, transformed into a social event. The hostess puts up the quilt frame in the parlour or the kitchen, and 6 or 8 women sit around it on chairs drawn close to the frame, each working her needle through the layers from her own section of the quilt. And they sew, and they talk from mid-morning to late afternoon, and the work that would have taken one woman a week is completed in a day. The conversation at a quilting bee covers everything that conversation in this community covers: the welfare of families, the health of children, the price of goods at the store, the conduct of neighbours, the upcoming social calendar. It is also where information is transferred. Recipes, remedies, techniques for dealing with the particular difficulty that this season has brought. The corn husking bee happens in October, when the corn has dried on the stalk and needs to be brought in and processed before the winter rains come. The ears are brought in from the field in wagon loads and piled in the barn, and the community gathers to husk them, pulling back the dried husk from each ear and tossing it to one pile, the ear to another. A red ear of corn found in the pile earns the finder the right to kiss whoever she or he chooses, a custom of uncertain origin that is the closest thing to explicit flirtation that most of these communities officially sanction. By the end of the evening, the pile of husked corn is enormous, and the pile of husks is larger still, and the husks themselves will be used for animal bedding and for filling mattresses and for making chair padding. Visiting, the art of calling on a neighbour without prior arrangement, is a primary social form of rural pre-electric life. You might walk or drive to a neighbouring farm on a Sunday afternoon to call on the family there, bringing a cake or a jar of preserves as a mark of consideration and staying for 2 or 3 hours of conversation in the parlour or the kitchen depending on the weather and the formality of the occasion. The visit serves social purposes: companionship, the exchange of news. But it also serves practical ones. You see how the family is getting along. You observe whether the wife looks tired or the husband looks discouraged. You note whether the children seem healthy. This informal mutual observation is the community's primary welfare system, and it works because the community is small enough that everyone knows everyone's situation well enough to notice when it changes. The travelling peddler is a seasonal visitor to the farm, typically appearing in the spring when roads are passable again after winter. He comes with a wagon loaded with goods: tinware, needles and thread, ribbons, patent medicines, small tools, possibly a bolt or two of fabric. And he is welcomed with an enthusiasm that is partly genuine interest in the goods he carries, and partly the simple pleasure of a visitor who brings news from outside the immediate community. He has been to other farms, other counties, perhaps other states, and the price of his needles and his nutmeg includes the incidental intelligence of where he has been and what he saw there. He will take trade as well as cash: beeswax, rags, old iron, feathers, whatever the household has accumulated as surplus. The blacksmith's shop, a mile from the general store in most communities, is another hub of male community life. It is warm when everything else is cold, and the sound of hammer on iron carries a considerable distance on a still day, and the work done there is essential. Horseshoes reset, ploughshares sharpened, broken axles repaired, chains welded, tools made and maintained. Men stop at the blacksmith's shop the way later generations will stop at a gas station, on the way to something else, for a specific need, but also because it is a place where men gather and stand and talk while waiting for work to be done. The smith himself is a man of significant local status. His skill is not easily replaced. His knowledge is practical and substantial, and his shop is a place where the community's material life is maintained. The circuit preacher serves 3 or 4 small congregations on a rotating weekly schedule, arriving on horseback with his saddlebags and his worn Bible, staying with a family in the community for the night, and preaching the following morning, then moving on. He is not always a formally trained minister. The Methodist and Baptist circuit riders of the 19th century were often self-educated men with a theological seriousness and a physical stamina that made them suited to a travelling life conducted largely outdoors in all weather. He knows the families in his circuit the way a physician knows patients, through years of calling on them in the significant moments of their lives, the births and the deaths and the marriages and the seasons of hardship. He brings news from the other communities on his circuit, which means that the family that receives him also receives an informal report on how the wider neighbourhood is faring. His arrival is anticipated. The meal put on the table for a circuit preacher's supper is a step above the ordinary. Letter writing is one of the primary forms of social connection between people separated by distance in 1875. And it is practiced with a seriousness that the casual speed of modern communication has largely erased. A letter in this era is a composed document, not a quick note. It begins with the date and place, continues through the relevant news, the health of the family, the state of the farm, the weather of the past weeks, any events of significance in the community, and concludes with formal regards, and sometimes a postscript in which the most important or personal item is mentioned, as if saved for last. The letter is written in the best hand the writer can manage on paper that represents a small but real expenditure, folded and sealed and taken to the post office at the general store, where it waits for the mail carrier. The recipient, opening it days or weeks later, reads it carefully and sometimes aloud to the family, and the letter is kept, filed in the Bible or the kitchen drawer, because a letter is a physical connection to the person who wrote it and therefore not something to be treated as disposable. The midwife who serves your community is a woman of 50 or so, a widow who has been attending births in this county for 20 years, and has learned her practice through a combination of assisting other experienced women and accumulating her own experience case by case. She charges what the family can pay and sometimes nothing at all. She carries a bag of supplies, clean cloths, a bottle of laudanum for the worst pain, an herbal preparation she makes herself for slowing a hemorrhage, and she arrives when sent for and stays as long as she is needed. Her knowledge of birth is empirical and deep. She has seen most of the things that can happen and knows what to do about the ones for which anything can be done. She is also, in the community's practical reckoning, a repository of knowledge about the health of every family she has served. And in this role, she occupies a position that is something between nurse and counsellor and keeper of the community's most private histories. The smell of camphor reaches you from across the room on a January morning when someone in the house is sick, and it is a smell that carries its own particular anxiety with it. Not a bad smell exactly, but a smell associated with chest rubs and poultices, and the particular worried concentration with which a mother attends to a feverish child. Illness in pre-electric America is a different proposition from illness in any later era. The germ theory of disease is very new in 1875, and while educated physicians are beginning to accept it, it has not yet displaced older understandings in most households. Miasma, the theory that disease arises from bad air, from rotting matter, from the particular dampness of certain seasons and places, remains the operative explanation for most families. And the remedies that follow from it are organized around improving air, reducing dampness, and strengthening the constitution. The home medicine cabinet in a farmhouse of this era is not a single cabinet, so much as a collection of containers in various places. A shelf in the kitchen holding the most used remedies. A small chest in the parents' bedroom, where the more serious medicines are kept away from children's hands. The medicine crock in the cellar that holds homemade preparations. On the kitchen shelf you will typically find a bottle of laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, available without prescription at any druggist in the county, which is used for severe pain, for keeping a restless sick child quiet through the night, for the general category of suffering that needs to be brought down to a manageable level. Next to it, a bottle of paregoric, which is camphorated tincture of opium, used for colic and the stomach complaints of children. A tin of mustard powder for making poultices, a jar of goose grease for chest rubs, a bottle of castor oil, the universal purgative, which is given for nearly everything on the theory that if the body is sufficiently cleared out, it will heal itself. The herbs that the garden and the nearby fields provide are the primary medicine of the household for ordinary ailments. Boneset, a tall white-flowered plant that grows in the damp edges of the field, is dried and made into a bitter tea for fevers. Chamomile is grown in the kitchen garden for its calming properties, and is given to children for stomach upset and to adults for sleeplessness. Yarrow, which grows wild in every roadside and field edge, is applied to cuts and wounds to promote clotting. Catnip tea is the household's remedy for children's fevers, made by steeping the dried herb in hot water and sweetening it slightly with honey or maple sugar to make it drinkable. Elderberry, made into a syrup in the fall when the berries are ripe, is given through the winter for colds and coughs. The knowledge of these plants and their uses is held primarily by women, and is transferred from mother to daughter in the same informal, practical way that cooking knowledge is transferred. Calomel, mercurous chloride, is the physician's remedy of choice for a very wide range of conditions in 1875, prescribed so commonly that its use has become nearly reflexive. It is a powerful purgative, and in large doses, a dangerous one. The mercury in it causes nerve damage and tooth loss with repeated use, and the practice of giving it in heroic doses that was common earlier in the century is beginning to fall out of favour, though it is far from gone. The country doctor who serves your district will prescribe it for fevers, for stomach complaints, for a range of conditions whose connection to intestinal function is at best indirect. You receive the prescription with the respect due a professional opinion, and administer it with a certain private skepticism, based on what you have seen happen to people who took it repeatedly. Patent medicines are everywhere in 1875 America, and their advertising is a feature of every newspaper that reaches the farm. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for women's complaints. Dr. Kilmer's swamp root for kidney and bladder problems. Ayer's cherry pectoral for throat and lung conditions. These preparations contain, in most cases, significant percentages of alcohol, often 30 to 40%, plus various plant extracts, and in some cases opium or cocaine in small quantities. They are not necessarily ineffective. The alcohol has a genuine calming effect. Several of the plant extracts have real medicinal properties, and the placebo effect of a commercial preparation with a confident label and a positive reputation should not be dismissed. But their specific claims are largely unsubstantiated, and their widespread use reflects both the shortage of reliable medical care and the human desire for a specific answer to a specific problem. Childbirth remains the single greatest health risk faced by women in this era. A woman who survives to adulthood and marries and begins having children in 1875 faces a cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth that is significantly higher than any risk she faces from any other cause. The maternal mortality rate in the United States in this period is estimated at around 500 deaths per 100,000 live births, far higher than in any developed nation today. The causes are primarily puerperal fever, which is infection introduced during or after delivery, and which kills within days in its acute form, and hemorrhage, which can be sudden and catastrophic. The midwife who serves your community knows what to do when things go wrong up to a point, and beyond that point, there is very little anyone can do. You know this, and you do not let yourself think about it too directly, because thinking about it does not change it, and you have a life to get on with. Fevers are managed at home with the tools available. Cold compresses on the forehead and wrists, bone set and yarrow teas administered every few hours. The patient kept warm enough to sweat, but not so warm as to increase the fever further. Small amounts of food. Broth, soft-boiled eggs, bread soaked in milk, given when the patient can take them. A very high fever in a child is managed with the urgency it deserves. And if the fever has not broken within 2 or 3 days, or if the symptoms suggest something beyond the ordinary, someone rides or drives to fetch the doctor. The doctor is a 12-mile round trip in good weather, and a considerably more arduous journey in winter, and his arrival does not always mean that things will improve, but his presence means that the family has done everything they could and is doing everything they can. Teeth are a particular affliction of the era. Without fluoride in the water supply, without modern restorative dentistry, without an understanding of the relationship between sugar consumption and tooth decay, the teeth of Americans in 1875 are generally in poor condition by the standards of any later generation. Toothache is common and is managed with clove oil applied directly to the affected area, with whiskey as a topical analgesic, with the laudanum bottle in severe cases. When a tooth is past saving, it is extracted, and extraction is done by the local dentist if you can reach one, or by the doctor, or by the blacksmith in extreme cases, or in an emergency by whoever happens to be present with a suitable pair of pliers and a strong hand. The extraction is done without anesthesia, except for whatever quantity of whiskey the patient has been able to consume beforehand, and it is an experience that its recipients do not forget. The country doctor who serves your area of the county is a man in his 50s who has been practicing medicine since before the Civil War, and who learned his trade partly in medical school and partly in a wartime field hospital, and mostly in 30 years of house calls. In all weather to patients who are sometimes already dead when he arrived, and sometimes alive, largely because of something their family had done for them in the days before he got there. He rides a good horse and knows the roads of the county better than anyone except the mail carrier. He charges what he can collect and writes off what he cannot. And his accounts ledger contains a significant percentage of entries marked with agricultural commodities: a quarter of beef, 2 bushels of corn, a cured ham, rather than cash money. He is not infallible, and the medicine he practices is not always effective, but his presence in the community is a genuine resource, and his absence, when he dies eventually or moves away, will be genuinely felt. When someone in the community dies, and in a community of this size and era, someone dies regularly enough that it is not exceptional, the dying happens at home, and the death happens at home, and the care of the body after death is a community responsibility. The women of the neighborhood wash and dress the body, laying it out on the parlor table or on boards set across sawhorses in the best room, and the family sits with the dead person through the night, a tradition called a wake or a sitting up, which is partly religious vigil and partly practical supervision in an era before embalming is routine. The coffin is made locally by the furniture maker who does this work on the side, or by a neighbor who has the woodworking skill, and it is plain wood, stained dark, lined with white cloth. The funeral happens within 2 or 3 days of the death, because without embalming, there is no preserving a body through a long waiting period, and the burial in the church cemetery brings the whole community together in the particular quiet solidarity that grief produces in small places where everyone knew the person who died. The management of a sick child through the night is a particular kind of labor that falls on the mother almost always, and it consists of a series of small acts repeated at intervals across the hours of darkness. You rise every hour or two to check the child's temperature by touch, the back of your hand against the forehead, the particular quality of heat that distinguishes the warmth of a sleeping child from the heat of a fever. You give the bone-set tea if the fever has climbed, spooned in small amounts if the child is too sick to drink readily. You change the cold compress on the forehead, dipping the cloth in the bowl of water you have set near the fire, wringing it out, laying it back. You watch the rhythm of breathing. It should be steady and slow. And if it is not, if it quickens or becomes shallow, or makes a sound it should not make, you are fully awake, and the lamp is lit before you have consciously decided to light it. Between these acts you sit in the rocking chair near the child's bed, with a quilt over your lap, and you doze in the light of the banked fire, not truly sleeping, the part of you that is attending to the child never fully resting. By morning, you are tired in a way that is different from ordinary tiredness. It is the tiredness of sustained alertness, the tiredness of watching. There is a stoicism about illness and death in this world that is sometimes mistaken, by people looking back at it, for emotional coldness. It is not coldness. It is the specific quality of emotional adaptation that comes from living in a world where illness is common and death is proximate, and the tools to prevent either are limited. You grieve your dead. You fear illness in your children with a fear that is very physical and specific, and does not diminish with repetition. But you also get up the next morning and do the work, because the fire will not light itself, and the cow will not milk herself, and the children who are still alive need breakfast, and the work of the living must continue even in the presence of loss. This is not a lesson anyone in 1875 was taught. It is the shape of the life. The light changes in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in January, in a way you have been watching your whole life. It does not simply diminish, it changes quality first, going from the flat grey-white of a winter afternoon to something warmer and more amber, the particular colour that low winter light takes on in the last half hour before it disappears altogether. The kitchen window, which faces west, holds the last of this light for a few minutes after the rest of the room has gone dim, a bright rectangle in the darkening wall. Then that too fades. The fire in the hearth, which has been burning all day, now becomes the room's primary light source, its orange glow moving on the walls and ceiling, a living light that is softer and more uneven than any lamp. The evening meal, called supper in the vocabulary of this household and most others like it, to distinguish it from the midday dinner, is simpler than the noon meal as a rule. The heaviest cooking of the day has already been done. Supper in January might be a bowl of leftover corn mush, reheated in the skillet, fried until it is crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, served with maple syrup if there is any, or with the last of the apple butter from the jar on the shelf. It might be bean soup made from the dried beans that have been soaking since morning, simmered with a ham bone from the smokehouse, and a handful of dried herbs and a turnip from the cellar. It might be nothing more elaborate than bread and butter and cold sliced pork from the noon meal, with tea made from dried herbs since the coffee grounds are saved for the morning. Supper is filling and warm, and it closes out the physical demands of the day. After supper, the lamp is lit. This is a ritual that has its own sequence and care. You take the kerosene lamp from the shelf where it has sat through the day, and you check the level of kerosene in the reservoir by tilting it slightly and looking through the glass. A lamp that runs dry while burning can crack the glass chimney as the temperature suddenly drops. You trim the wick with the small scissors that live in the drawer of the kitchen table, cutting away the charred portion carefully so the new wick edge is clean and even, which will give a steadier, less smoky flame. You strike a match and touch it to the trimmed wick, and the flame catches with a soft sound, a whisper of combustion, and you adjust the wick up until the flame is the right height, high enough to give useful light, low enough not to produce excessive smoke, and settle the chimney over it. The quality of kerosene lamplight in a kitchen is worth dwelling on, because it is so different from any artificial light available in the modern world that description barely does it justice. It is warm, very warm, yellowish-orange, flattering to skin and wood and pottery and everything it touches. It flickers slightly, not from the flame itself, which is relatively steady once the chimney is settled, but from the movement of air in the room. Every time the kitchen door opens, every time someone walks briskly past the lamp, the flame wavers. The shadows it makes are deep and move. The room beyond the lamp's immediate circle is genuinely dark. The corners of the kitchen, the space under the table, the far end of the settle. And these shadows are not threatening or uncomfortable, but are simply the natural boundary of available light. You have always lived in a room with a dark end and a bright end. Reading is the evening's primary intellectual occupation for those who have the literacy and the access to reading material to sustain it. The family Bible is on the parlour shelf, and it is read on Sundays and at family devotions if the household observes them. The almanac, Old Farmer's Almanac or one of its regional competitors, a thin paper-covered booklet of weather predictions, agricultural advice, tide tables for people who live near water, and miscellaneous practical information, is the other indispensable reading matter, consulted repeatedly through the year, and read in the evenings for its articles and jokes and general practical wisdom. A newspaper may arrive weekly from the county seat, folded and addressed and carried by the mail rider, or picked up at the store. And there may be a book or two, novels, in households that can afford them and have someone with the taste for fiction, or a volume of sermons, or a history of the county or the state. Reading aloud is a practice that has no precise modern equivalent, because the experience of reading aloud to a gathered family in the evening is not simply an accommodation for the illiterate. It is a social form. The person reading aloud, the father most commonly, though not exclusively, is performing the text for an audience, and the audience is participating in the experience together, which is different from each person reading separately and silently. A good reader creates the experience in the room. The voices of characters given different qualities, the descriptions of scenes rendered with inflection that makes them visible. Families read Dickens this way, and the novels of Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Families read the newspaper this way, one person reading the political news and the advertisements and the shipping reports, while the others listen and interject. It is the evening's entertainment, and it is communal in a way that later forms of entertainment would mostly not be. Sewing and mending by lamplight is the occupation that keeps the women of the household busy in the evenings through the winter. The lamp is pulled close to the chair, as close as possible without the heat of the chimney becoming unpleasant, and the work is arranged in the cone of light. Fine work, the kind that requires seeing small stitches clearly, must be done near the lamp, and cannot be done if the lamp is low on fuel, or if the wick has not been trimmed recently. Coarser work, darning thick wool socks, basting a seam that will be finished later, can be done at the lamp's edge, in the lighter shadow. The needle goes in and out of the fabric in the lamplight with a quiet, rhythmic sound, or rather a near silence, just the soft movement of thread through cloth and the occasional snip of the scissors and the sound of the thread being pulled through. The clock is the household's other technology of time, and it marks the evening hours in a way that gives the unelectrified darkness its structure. The wooden mantel clock on the parlour shelf, a 30-hour or 8-day mechanism that was bought new in the 1840s or inherited, that has been wound by a series of hands on a series of evenings, that has kept this household's time through births and deaths and ordinary Tuesdays, without distinction, strikes the hours in a clear, resonant tone that is audible in every room of the house. 8 o'clock, the children are in bed. 9 o'clock, the mending is put away, the lamp is turned down. 10 o'clock is late in this house, late enough that only unusual circumstances keep anyone up to hear it. The bedtime routine for the adults of the household has its own sequence of small acts that close the day. The fire in the kitchen hearth is banked. The large coals are pushed together at the centre of the hearth and covered with ash, packed firmly to slow the combustion and hold the heat through the night without burning freely and dangerously. The lamp is extinguished. Turn the wick down until the flame goes out, the smell of kerosene smoke briefly strong, then gone. The kitchen door is bolted. The windows are already shut against the cold. The water bucket is brought in from the step where it would freeze and set near the banked fire. These acts take perhaps 10 minutes and are done in the near dark after the lamp is out, by firelight and the small light of the candle carried for the purpose. The almanac on the kitchen shelf is the household's most consulted book after the Bible, and its status as a practical document does not prevent it from also being the evening's reading matter on many ordinary nights. The Old Farmer's Almanac has been published annually since 1792, and a copy comes into this house every year, bought at the store in the fall when the new edition arrives. It tells you, for every day of the year, the expected weather for the region, predictions made by a formula that combines astronomical data with folk observation, not always accurate but consulted seriously, and the times of sunrise and sunset, the phases of the moon, the tides if you are anywhere near water. It also contains articles on agricultural practices, recipes, medical advice, puzzles, jokes, and miscellaneous information of the kind that fills the spaces in a life lived without other printed entertainment. On an evening when the newspaper has not come, and there is no letter to be read, and the Bible has been read already this week, the almanac provides you read the weather forecast for the coming weeks, the long-range outlook for the winter, the dates when the moon will be full and when it will be dark, and you absorb this information with the same quiet attention you give to everything that may be useful. The house at night, after the lamp is out and the family is in bed, makes sounds that are more audible in the dark than they were in the noise of the day. The fireplace in the parlour, cold and unused, contracts as the outside temperature drops through the night and produces a ticking sound. Irregular, like someone tapping a stone floor slowly. The front door, which fits its frame well but not perfectly, allows a thin thread of cold air through the gap at the bottom that makes a faint whispering sound when the wind is from the north. The floorboards in the hallway above the kitchen, warmed by the heat from the kitchen during the day, now cool and contract, and the contracting produces a series of small sounds, a creak, a tick, a low moan from a board settling into a different position, that could be alarming to someone unfamiliar with the house, but are, to the people who live here, as known and unremarkable as their own heartbeats. In a pre-electric world, these are the sounds of home at night. Not silence, but the house's own breathing, its own ordinary conversation with the cold. Bedtime in winter, the actual arrival in the cold bedroom with only a candle for light, is a brisk, efficient process. There are no elaborate rituals to delay it. The bedroom is cold. You know it is cold. You get into the cold bed quickly and lie still while your body heat begins to warm the space under the quilts. In the coldest weather, a wrapped hot brick heated on the hearth and carried up wrapped in flannel will be tucked at the foot of the bed, and you push your feet against it and feel the warmth moving up through the blankets. A bed warmer, a long-handled iron pan filled with coals and run between the sheets, serves the same purpose if one is available. The sheets are cold cotton. The pillow is cold. The quilts pile up, their weight familiar and comfortable. The darkness in the bedroom is total. No light from outside, no glow under the door, nothing. The last sound you hear before sleep is the wind or the fire settling in the banked hearth below, or the sound of the house itself breathing in the cold. The fire is burning down to coals now. The last large log added 2 hours ago and well consumed, the flame low and reddish and no longer needing attention. The kitchen is warm, genuinely warm from the day's fire and the supper cooking and the bodies that have been in it through the evening. And this warmth will hold for another hour or so before the cold begins to reassert itself. The lamp is low on the table, the flame turned to its minimum, just enough light to see by for the last few minutes before it is extinguished for the night. The clock has struck 9. The children are asleep upstairs. The cat is curled on the settle, near the fire. The house is very quiet. There is a particular quality to the quiet of a farmhouse at this hour, at this time of year, in this part of the country. It is not silence. Silence is the absence of everything, and this is not that. It is the settling into the background of all the sounds that have been present all day. The sounds of work and weather and voices and animals, until what remains is the small continuous sounds that the house and the night make on their own. The low sigh of the wind along the eave, the occasional tick of a beam contracting in the cold, the breath of the banked fire, the infinitely distant sound of the creek at the edge of the property, moving under its January ice. You take the candle from the table and carry it to the hearth for the banking. The motion of carrying the candle has been done 10,000 times and has its own economy of gesture. The hand cupped around the flame, the body turned slightly to shield it from the air, moved by walking. At the hearth, you use the iron poker to push the remaining coals together into a single mound at the center, and you heap the ash over and around them, packing it gently with the flat side of the poker until the coals are buried and the fire is quieted to nothing visible, only a slow warmth emanating from the ash mound. It will hold until morning. It almost always holds until morning. The stairs in this house are steep, and the treads are narrow, and you know them exactly. The 4th step creaks near the wall, the 7th step is slightly lower than the others, and your foot always expects the floor a moment early. The top step is the highest, and you have stubbed your toe on it in the dark often enough that you step up it deliberately and slowly. The candle makes a moving island of light on the staircase wall, your shadow large and distorted in it. And above the stairs the hallway is cold, noticeably colder than the kitchen you have just left, the warmth from the fire not reaching this far. The bedroom smells of the cold and of the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where the good blankets are stored in summer, and of the particular warm sleep smell of the quilts that have been holding the memory of bodies through the night for years. You set the candle on the windowsill and undress quickly. This is not the hour for slowness. The cold has its own efficiency, and you put on the nightgown that has been warming on the hook near the bedside, or at least has been in a less cold location than the rest of the room. And you get into bed with the practiced speed of someone who has done this in winter bedrooms their whole life. The cold of the sheets is its own kind of fact, immediate and complete, pressing in from all sides as you settle into the bed. You pull the quilts up over your shoulders and lie still, and within a few minutes your body's warmth begins to build under the covers, and the sheets nearest your skin begin to lose their chill, and the bed begins to feel like what a bed is supposed to feel like. The candle on the windowsill makes a small round light on the ceiling, and you watch it for a moment. The steady, breathing flame, the slow movement of its light on the plaster, and then you reach across and pinch it out. The dark that follows is complete. Outside the window, the January night has no moon, and the stars, which were bright earlier, are covered now by cloud. The field beyond the fence is invisible. The barn is a shape you know is there but cannot see. The road is lost in the dark. The only light in any direction is the faint red glow that comes barely from the banked hearth in the kitchen below, perceptible under the bedroom door as the thinnest line of warmth-coloured dark. Everything else is night, the particular deep and total night of a pre-electric world, the night that every human being from the beginning of time until very recently slept within. The warmth is coming fully now, the quilts having gathered enough heat that you have stopped feeling the cold at the edges. The pillow is warming under your head. Your hands are still against the quilt's surface. The day has been long in the way that all days in this life are long. Physical, continuous, full from before dawn to after dark, with tasks that required your body and your attention. And the weight of it is settling into your bones, not as discomfort, but as the particular heaviness of a body that has been used fully and is now allowed to rest. Your breathing slows. The sound of the wind outside the window is very far away. There is a sound the house makes just before the household is fully asleep. A settling, a gathering of its own quiet, that you have never stayed awake long enough to hear in its entirety, because by the time the house has reached it, you are already going under. It is the sound of the fire, breathing low in the banked hearth, the sound of the children in their beds upstairs breathing in their own slow rhythms, the sound of the wind moving in the elm outside the bedroom window, all of it becoming one continuous texture that is not any one of those things separately, but all of them together. It is the sound of the day releasing you. It comes every night, without exception, without drama, as reliable as the fire and as old as sleep itself. Tomorrow the fire will need building again before dawn. The water will need to be fetched. The animals will need tending. The bread will need baking. The wood will need splitting. All of this is true, and none of it needs to be thought about now. The dark is the boundary between the day and the next day. And here within it there is only this, the warm weight of the quilts, the deep quiet of the house, the sound of the wind in the bare trees along the lane, becoming softer and softer, until it is just a sound, just a texture of the silence, just the world doing what it does when no one is watching. The house is very quiet now. The fire in the kitchen below is banked and breathing, its warmth rising slowly through the floorboards. The night outside is dark and wide and still. The cold presses gently against the windows. Everything in this house is in its place. The quilts are heavy and warm. The pillow is soft under your head. The day is done. You are lying still. Your hands are at rest. Your shoulders are down. The weight of the day has left your body and settled somewhere beneath you, somewhere far away, somewhere that does not ask anything of you right now. The dark is complete, and it is comfortable. You are held by the dark and by the warmth and by the quiet that has settled over the house like a thing laid gently down. The sound of the wind has become the sound of your own breathing. The sound of your breathing has become the sound of the house settling. The sound of the house settling has become the sound of the night, wide and dark and ordinary and safe. Nothing is asked of you. Nothing needs to be done. The fire will hold until morning. The animals are settled in the barn. The children are asleep in the room down the hall. Let the weight come. Let your body be heavy. Let the warmth of the quilts be the only thing you feel, the only thing you know, that warmth spreading slowly from your center outward, until it reaches your hands and your feet and the space behind your eyes. The dark is soft. The dark is complete. The dark has been here every night of every winter. of every year this house has stood, and it will be here still when morning comes, waiting on the other side of the sleep you're moving toward. You are drifting now. The kitchen below is warm and banked and quiet. The window is frosted and dark. The barn is still. The road outside is empty and dark and cold. The stars above the clouds are turning, as they always turn across the January sky. The world is very large and very old and very slow, and you are one small warm thing in it, wrapped in quilts, breathing quietly, letting the dark carry you down. Sleep. The day is done. The house is safe. The fire will hold. The morning is a long time away, and there is nothing between you and it but this: the warm dark, the heavy quilts, the slow sound of your own breathing going deeper and slower and quieter, quieter, until it is barely a sound at all. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well.